let me officially thank everyone for being here for Out in Science 2021. My name is Stephanie Miller, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. I use the pronouns she, her, and they, them, and I am a postdoc and systems neuroscientist in the lab of Jorge Polyp at the Gladstone Institutes. Gladstone is hosting today's event. Gladstone is an independent biomedical research institution in San Francisco that strives to overcome unsolved diseases. I myself am a queer, non-binary, mixed-race Latinx person, and I have worked to support the LGBTQ plus community, specifically via transgender advocacy, for over 15 years. I am very excited to be moderating today's event. Out in Science is a panel discussion with academic leaders and STEM professionals that explores the lives and careers of LGBTQ plus scientists and helps provide role models for young people. This is an annual event that's been organized since 2014 by the LGBTQ plus community group at Gladstone, as well as the Graduate and Postdoc Queer Alliance and the LGBT Resource Center, both at the University of California, San Francisco. And I do want to mention that the LGBT Resource Center at UCSF is like nationally renowned. So I encourage everyone to check out that center. Now, normally this is an in-person event, but given the pandemic, we'll be having it virtually this year, which has actually made some things possible that might not have been. Now, our theme for today is going to be mentorship in the LGBTQ plus STEM community. And this is important because finding a mentor who shares not only our scientific expertise, but also, ideally, for example, a queer identity can be challenging, especially in the pandemic, but connecting with the larger community can really provide an essential support system. And making that connection with our community is one of the best ways to find mentors who can guide us along our career paths and open new doors. Personally, I have had wonderful experiences receiving truly life-changing mentorship, both from mentors from our community, as well as mentors who are and were out and proud allies, just as important. Now we have 4 amazing panelists with us today who will share their insights and unique experiences, and of course offer advice both for young queer scientists and for the allies and institutions that can support them. We're going to start with a panel discussion, and we'll save time at the end for your questions so that everyone can have an opportunity to take part in this conversation. Before I introduce the panelists, I do have a few housekeeping notes, which I'll try to get through quickly. Importantly, in this discussion, we will likely use the term LGBTQ plus to refer to our broad and very diverse community. And so I just want to be clear that we are seeking to be inclusive of all sexual, gender, and relationship diverse people, including asexual, two-spirit, Native people, same gender loving people, and everyone else who has been historically and currently marginalized on the basis of who they are. Now, this event is currently being live streamed on Facebook, and it's also being recorded, which means that you can access the archived recording on the Gladstone Institute YouTube channel, I think around next week when it's been posted. As I mentioned, we've enabled the live transcription, so you can toggle that on and off at the bottom of your screen, both via Facebook Live as well as this Zoom meeting here. You can submit your questions anytime during the discussion by using the Q&A button. There's also a chat button, which we encourage you guys to use to talk to each other, to share comments as our panel proceeds. If you would like to submit your questions via Facebook Live, you can also use that chat screen because there's not a Q&A there, but we'll be monitoring the chat, and we're going to try to answer as many of your questions as we can. If you would like to reach out directly to our panelists, I would encourage you to wait until the last, say, 10 minutes of our event, just so that they're not distracted with DMs, but we do encourage you to connect with them. So please do wait if you'd like to reach out to them until around 2:20 p.m. Pacific or 5:20 p.m. Eastern, if that's where you're at. And if you're sharing on social media, you can use our hashtag #OutInScience. All right, now I'm going to be introducing our 4 panelists, and I'm going to ask them why it's important to be out in science. Then we'll get into the heart of our discussion. So I'm going to begin with our first panelist, Millie Copera. She uses she, her pronouns. Millie is a senior scientific recruiter at Recruitomics Consulting, where she helps biotech companies hire scientists. She's a PhD in neuroscience and was previously a career exploration program specialist at UC Davis, where she helped PhD students explore a wide variety of careers. She also served as the co-chair of the Chancellor's Committee for LGBTQIA+ communities at UC Davis. And she's always been motivated to support students and researchers in advancing their careers. And she's a fervent advocate for equality and inclusion, especially in STEM. She is a queer Latina immigrant from Peru who grew up undocumented and low income and hopes that she can pave the way for others with similar experiences. So to Millie, thank you so much for being with us here today. Why is it important to be out in science?
Thanks for having me. It's a really important question, and a lot of the introduction kind of answers part of it as well. It's particularly important to me, one, for my mental health in terms of bringing my whole self being really important. Two, providing that mentorship and representation that I just didn't see, especially with the intersection of my own identities when I was a researcher moving through academia. Those types of mentors were not present. So I want to be what I didn't see personally. And I also realize that I'm in a privileged place to feel safe enough to be out. So anyone that isn't and can't be, love to be kind of a point of connection for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Millie. I'm now going to turn to Angel Kaur. She is an assistant professor of neuroscience at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and she uses she, her pronouns. She is a neurobiologist by training, and her research focuses on high impact practices in undergraduate STEM education in a liberal arts environment. Angel is currently serving as an associate faculty fellow for the UNC System Digital Learning Initiative. Gosh, that sounds important during the pandemic. And will join the UNC Asheville Center for Teaching and Learning as a faculty fellow this fall. She is also an artist and graphic designer and a mom to 6-year-old twins and a 75-pound puppy. Angel, thank you so much for being a panelist. Why is it important to you to be out in science?
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And it's, I've been thinking about this question, why it's important to me. And I think the root of it all is I can't imagine not being my whole self. I'm just far too loud for that. I'm far too impulsive for that. And there is a lot of comfort in just presenting who you are, your whole self, and then letting the people decide if they want to be around you or not. So kind of, to echo what Millie said, it's a mental health safekeeping thing to just be myself, because I need to be able to breathe every day to do the work that I do. And again, to echo Millie, I have a lot of intersections as well, and I'm sure we'll get to at some point within my own identity. And when I'm working with undergraduates, I want to be able to, again, be my whole self with them as well, because I know that's important to my experience in the classroom, which will then be important to their experience in the classroom, but also to serve as that person that I never saw. I had a lot of peers that were queer growing through college and even later on, and peer mentorship has been huge in my life, but I never really had those older mentors that had been through some stuff that looked like me and whatnot. So yeah, I can't imagine not being out.
Well, we really appreciate you being here today, and true that it takes a lot of energy to not bring our whole selves to any of the spaces that we live and work in. Now I'll turn to our third panelist, Jonathan Mathias Lasseter. He uses he, him pronouns, and he is an assistant professor of psychology at Rowan University, as well as founder and chief psychology officer of Lasseter Health Initiatives. He's a polymath who uses psychology, writing, and dance to help others heal and thrive. His roles include licensed clinical psychologist, professor, author, public speaker, and choreographer. He is the co-editor of the award-winning text, Black LGBT Health in the United States, the Intersection of Race, Gender, and Sexual Orientation. He is currently working on his first sole-authored book that will explore contemporary issues of race and mental health in the United States. Jonathan, it's great to have you with us today. Can you tell us why it's important to be out in science?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this discussion. This is such an important topic. So thank you so much for having me. It is important to be out in science because we claim our space when we do that. Often it's people from marginalized communities. And again, I echo my colleagues, we talk about the intersections. A lot of us are marginalized in intersectional ways. So it becomes so important to let people know that we are here. And when we do that, we destabilize the status quo. We agitate those power structures that say we don't exist, or we should not be out in science, or you know, there's a particular way to be out in science. So we make space for ourselves. And then we also blaze that path. We model what that's like for others who may be struggling, who may not have the same levels of privilege and power as we do. We tear down those barriers so that they don't have to. And finally, I echo my colleagues in saying it is about our mental health. It is about our well-being and being out in science. So when we define ourselves, then we create ourselves and we ensure our health.
Snaps, many snaps. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'll now turn to our fourth and final panelist, Dr. Sharon Milgram, who I will note has been one of my personal mentors. Sharon uses the pronouns she and her. She is the director of the Office of Intramural Training and Education at the National Institutes of Health, where she directs a trans NIH office dedicated to the career advancement of over 5,000 trainees. Sharon has a PhD in cell biology and was formerly a full professor in the Department of Cell and Developmental Biology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She lectures widely on scientific careers, mentorship, leadership, and management in research environments. She lives in Tacoma Park, Maryland, with her wife and son. Sharon, I am truly thrilled to have you on our panel today. In your opinion, why is it important to be out in science?
I'm going to address the science part first and say that health disparities in the LGBTQ plus community have persisted a long time because researchers aren't doing what needs to be done, because funders aren't funding enough research on LGBTQ health. And every queer scientist at the table, whether that be at a study section, a meeting about department research interests, a career panel, every one of us sitting there is a reminder that the healthcare and research community has let us down. And I think that that's a really important thing. Personally, I was in the closet for a long time. I grew up in a very small religious community. Girls were expected to do certain things, not to become professors and certainly not to be queer. And so it was a hard fought coming out, and I can't imagine being any other way. Furthermore, I love my wife and I love my life and I love what we've built together. And I think it really negates it when we hesitate. And so I think that any healthy relationship is built on trying to be honest. And this is one way I try to be honest.
We appreciate it very much. Thank you again to all of our panelists. I will now turn to the questions that we've prepared, and then later on we'll get to questions from the audience. So our first topic is scientific trajectory and challenges. This will be exploring trajectories, of course, in STEM, and specifically unique challenges that you all may have faced about being open in your queer and your identities writ large, and how those experiences have shaped your professional path. So I will begin with Millie. Millie, what are some of the unique challenges that you faced as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and how have you overcome these challenges?
I'd like to say that there have been many challenges, and I'm sure a lot of folks have shared those, even to this day, still navigating some of those. But, you know, trying to navigate them with community, like we mentioned before. We mentioned earlier, one of my colleagues mentioned the energy that it takes just to think about those small portions of our lives that maybe make us think twice when we hold our partner's hand in public. When we talk about if I were to talk about my wife, just off the bat, I've already come out in a very maybe, you know, casual setting. Those are things that don't take that energy if you're in a normative, heteronormative kind of situation. And that that's kind of an ever-present thing that I am processing and things like that. But I would say that energy has been kind of a big challenge that's kind of ever-present. I can't name individual ones other than, small microaggressions here and there that I won't delve into, but and navigating things with family has always been tricky. And that's part of my desire to also be part of that representation, and have others be seen who have shared experiences with me in terms of trying to communicate with my parents and translating LGBT topics into Spanish. That is something that you don't see, you don't hear talked about very often. So that's a snippet. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. By the way, I'll just mention to our panelists today that although I have perhaps picked a person who to toss questions to first, feel free to just jump in if there's something that you'd like to share on a topic that I'm not have tossed to you initially. So just want to let our panelists to know that. At this point, I will pivot to Angel. If you could mention any unique challenges that you may have faced as a member of the LGBTQ plus community and how that has gone.
I consider myself really lucky that I haven't had a lot of challenges personally in my scientific career. And part of it is the intersectionality. It's hard to tell when you're being discriminated against because you're queer rather than because you're a woman in STEM or a brown woman in STEM, or just don't know when to shut up because you have ADHD and didn't learn about this till 3 years ago, right? So there's, it's hard to pick apart sometimes where those microaggressions are necessarily coming from, and that's been there. But my undergraduate experience, as Steph and I had talked about before, was at a Seven Sister Schools at Bryn Mawr College, which was a very safe space. And I think that community of peers, that was the first, sort of peer mentoring that I experienced, though I didn't know to call it that then. That has been my safety net and my go-to place to feel that belonging and caring and the love that you need in order to put down the microaggressions and walk away from them. And so I feel like that kind of protected me in a way, or at least when things did come up, I felt like I had an army with me rather than me being there alone. And so I don't have a particular one to tell you about, but I think that's why.
I hear you on that. I also, as you mentioned, feel very fortunate and super privileged to have gone also to one of these historically women's colleges, one of the Seven Sisters. I went to Mount Holyoke, where I also, joined the rugby team and really just marinated in queer culture. And
they tried to get me to join the rugby team, and I was like, guys, I have chronic pain. I am not getting on a rugby team. There's just no way. No,
it's not a sustainable hobby. You can only do that for so long, but I had fun while it lasted. All right, so I'm going to move on. I'm now going to ask, I think I'll begin with Jonathan. A similar question. I wonder if you could comment on how being out has shaped your scientific trajectory.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's definitely shaped it in the sense that I'm very intentional. Everything that I do is about my calling. And science is a pathway to that calling. And so what I mean by that is that I believe that at least part of my calling is to help ensure the liberation of marginalized communities, right? And one of those marginalized communities are LGBTQ plus people, right? And everyone at those intersections. And so my research program is definitely focused on highlighting those voices. I love doing mixed method and multi-method work and getting that qualitative piece in there because it's so important to have these communities speak for themselves. And even though I'm part of the community, I'm an N of one. So I also want to make sure that I am not having my voice overshadow so many other important voices. And so it really shapes the work that I do. It also shapes how I do the work. Oftentimes, I work in the health and equity sphere, and oftentimes there's a focus on the deficit-based models or the things that are going wrong. And my work particularly looks at strengths. And so I see a lot of barriers there, even in funding announcements. They want you to do a study about intersectional stigma, but there's not a discussion about intersectional strengths. right? And the ways in which we thrive. So my research really pushes back against that. And we'll see how successful I am in the funding sphere, but I have to do the work regardless. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Personally, I feel so grateful to be queer. All right, now, Sharon, if it's all right, I'd like to ask you about whether your identity played a role in how you pursued, a career in academia or other sectors.
So I came out when I was a full professor. Well, I think I was probably an associate professor. I probably had a lab of about 16 to 18 people. I met a woman and she said, I'm not dating someone in the closet. And I said, well, I'm not giving up on you. So here I go. And my research is very oriented at a cellular level. So I don't think my identity as a queer scientist drives my science, but it does drive my role as an educator. I am very intentionally out. I tell stories where it's not necessary to come out, and I make sure the story includes my wife and I, because I think every student needs to see a director of a very large office at the NIH say my wife without any sense of shame. And so I do think it really impacts my trajectory right now. Also, an interesting identity that nobody sees of mine is I am the white mom of a Black man who is actually in LA now. He left right before the pandemic, and we can't wait to get him home for just a week or so. And I think that being queer makes me much more careful as an ally. I think that I have a strong feeling of social justice from the religious community I grew up in, but I think being queer makes me more careful and intentional in the programs I run and the things we offer our students, our wellness program, making sure that there are multiple identities in our wellness staff. I think a lot of that comes from feeling invisible earlier in my life and feeling a need to hide. And so science-wise, I studied epithelial cell biology and the transport of proteins across cells. And it's hard to say being queer had anything to do with that. But now I think every day I realize that pain of really feeling invisible as a college student. It's so interesting when I hear you and Angel talk about having peers in college. I'm like, oh, I had to go to the library and look up. Like I was like whispering to the librarian, I think I like girls. Is there something I can read? Right. And so I don't want that to be a part of academic or research spaces. So it doesn't drive my research, but definitely drives my work.
I heard that. And since it was not long ago that I was one of the students in your audience when I was conducting my PhD research at NIH, on those occasions when you had mentioned, your wife and your family, I heard that and it really resonated. So I just want to thank you for those moments of, obtuse visibility. Really, there's a role for that.
Thank you.
Can I just say how important that is, that even in the topics, the subject areas that aren't, directly or blatantly diversity related, that we're still telling these stories? Because I often hear colleagues, they're like, oh, I teach statistics. Why would I want to talk about it? It's just like, oh, it's so important in every single sphere. So I just really appreciate you highlighting that.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. I'm going to now move to the topic of mentors and role models. So representation, as you just said, Jonathan, is so important in STEM, especially being able to see your identity reflected in that of your professors and in the leaders of your organizations. This can really help us see ourselves in those positions someday. I know that having out and proud role models has been really crucial to my personal professional trajectory. So I wondered if I could begin with you, Angel. What motivates you to be a role model in our community?
I think that a way that I make peace with being the intersection of quite so many things is that this is my job, is to be that visibility, is to be that person that, most students in my class are going to connect with me, but it will be over different things. and it will give them an opportunity to see themselves in a different position than they might have before. And I don't know which of my various identities that's going to click with a different student, but holding space to that is important to me. To I guess kind of to go to what Jonathan was saying, kind of like the calling idea. I think my calling is to just let people see that it doesn't really matter if you get a 2.7 in molecular biology. You can still teach molecular biology someday, which is my real life true story.
True that. Jonathan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on why it's important for you to be a mentor in our community.
Because so often we just don't have them, even in 2021. I was recently had the experience of looking at students, and we were in this setting where we were looking at who we want to admit, and they were talking about, you know, previous research experience. Like, oh, well, this person doesn't have previous research experience. And I said, well, this person is a Black queer woman who wants to do work with Black queer children. Where would she get that research experience? Mm-hmm. Right? But this is the standard. That's why it's so important that we exist, because it makes sense that people want to do work that they feel connected to. It doesn't make them less intelligent, doesn't make them less prepared for a career in science. They want to do work that they feel connected to, and they want to do that work with people that they feel understand them or will understand the path that they have to travel. And so again, it's my responsibility and my honor and my privilege to be one of those beacons of light, to say, we exist in this space, come join this community.
Can I
Thank you. Please.
Can I add something? So first of all, thank you. Really beautifully said, because one of the reasons that there isn't enough research on the health of our community is because we haven't been welcoming enough. At the NIH, we have summer internship programs. We have the largest post-bac program in the country, 1,700 energetic, crazy post-bac strong at the moment. We have PhD students who come for the summer. Steph was a PhD student who spent some years with us. If you don't feel that you are ready for an internship, I am your contact at NIH, because everybody starts with a first internship. And my first experience was not pretty. And I got slightly better GPA than you, Ingrid, but not much better. Like, we all start where we start. And if you have been getting lots of no's, reach out to me at NIH. You have to reach out more than once. I get a lot of emails. So reach out and then say, hey, Sharon, you didn't answer me, but please reach out. I mean, Jonathan's right. How are people going to get experience to do the work we need to do? So that's a part of what I can help with. We have large internship programs.
And this point on persistence, this is a useful life lesson in any case. Feel free to practice this by getting in contact with Sharon, which is an endeavor well worth it. At this point, I would love to actually ask the question around like advice for people. So I think that, Sharon, you just mentioned some really great pieces of advice to reach out. Maybe Millie, could you speak to what advice you would give, especially since, like, you know, you're in the profession of helping people connect with new careers. What advice do you have for people finding mentors and people who can help them sort of move along in their career path?
Yeah, and that connection piece is really clutch. That's usually the foundation of both kind of building personal community, but also professional community. It's been the foundation of a lot of my work, is connecting others with opportunities, with people who might have the positions that they would like to have. So reaching out, definitely, I think I would say, and persistence definitely would echo that. I would say also reframing your personal communities as folks that have other connections and other networks and things like that. The word networking always sounds so kind of, I don't know, sterile and perfunctory and just intimidating. And I'm always for reframing that into just building kind of genuine connections and sincere enthusiasm for someone else's experiences. And if that comes into play into like a vocation or a research topic, just wanting to learn more about their experiences goes a long way, and that always builds genuine connection. And so continuing to do that, please also reach out to me. I literally live on LinkedIn, and so I'm highly responsive on there. Would love to connect with people and connect them to other opportunities, or just briefly chat about what you're looking for, and I can keep an eye out for those things. But I love connecting people, and I love kind of, just like Jonathan mentioned, like knocking down those barriers for others so that it can be a lot easier for them. Knowing that this was a tricky thing, that I can tell someone maybe in bullet points how to navigate it a lot easier. So reaching out to people, definitely, and just leaning on your community as well. That's kind of my biggest, and reach out to me.
Totally. And if I may, I just want to mention to everybody in this audience, especially to the younger people, business cards are an actual thing, and they actually are a tool for this connection and this networking thing that, is a bit of a buzzword. But think of it more as like, it's just something to like help make the interaction memorable. And, even if you're just a student, you can make them in, Word and print them at Kinko's if that's still a thing, which is what I did. And it actually was a really great thing just to keep a couple of those in my wallet. So I just want to encourage the young people. Don't wait until, your work is printing them for you. You can make them at home, and they're really helpful anytime you're at even just a symposium in your own college, or if you're at some big national conference in your discipline. They're useful in many, many situations. All right, at this point, I'm going to move on to our next topic, which is allies and support systems. So in addition to having mentors, it's equally important for LGBTQ+ scientists to receive support from allies. Of course, allies can be individuals, but they can also be organizations, which play a crucial role in training young queer professionals and in creating environments that are inclusive and tailored to our community's needs. I will begin with Sharon. In your opinion, do allies who want to support our community have a different responsibility depending upon the stage of their career or level of influence?
So I think in every ally situation, the more stable you are in your career, the more responsibility you have. The more stable you are financially, the more responsibility you have in your community. I think that that's a given in everything. I'm trying to think if I see it any differently in the LGBTQ community. I don't think I do. I think that as we progress in our career, we are more stable, we have more contacts, we have a bigger platform to speak on, and we need to speak on that platform. With the caveat that if it's not safe to speak up, then nobody should feel obligated to speak up.
Absolutely. Now, Angela, I'd like to ask you, what are your thoughts on ways that allies can support our community, depending upon the stage of their career?
Treat us like people. We're all three-dimensional people that have three-dimensional aspects to us. And, I worry sometimes about when we talk about allyship in one context or another context. And I have the chat open because ADHD. And so I'm reading through it and seeing some of those things come up. And I think really approaching every individual as that whole person that has lots of different components to them that make them who they are. They're not, rub a brush on it, queer person, rub a brush on it, some other person. We're all people. And so making that space. And I think part of that is sharing your own whole self. And I think that's one thing that a lot of folks don't do, right? The conversations that happen on Twitter around, oh, scientists shouldn't have these views or that views, and I'm following you for the astronomy. Why is there a picture of a puppy? Because puppies are cute, and that's okay. And we can be whole people in that way. So I think that's something that every single person can do, is just meet another person genuinely in that 3D space. And that creates a greater amount of safety, because the easiest way to create safety for others is to be vulnerable. And if we can all do that, and we can all feel like we can stumble in front of each other, then that creates a greater amount of safety overall.
Absolutely. And gosh knows it's true that no single person can be everything. So it's important to be holding compassion for each other. Again, especially given the recent and ongoing global pandemic. At this point, I'd like to ask Millie, if you have any advice on how organizations can create more inclusive and supportive environments for LGBTQ plus researchers and professionals.
Yeah, I definitely say upfront, making sharing your pronouns just a normalized activity throughout all companies in every space that's next to a name, having everyone share them, just having that be kind of like a just a regular practice. Also, there's a lot of, especially this month, there's a lot of performative behaviors from companies, and seeing a lot more action behind that, specifically financially, is kind of how you really put your money where your mouth is, right? Literally, those actions need to be there to back up kind of, yeah, pronouns are important. And that's just the very beginning. Like, we need to make larger actions. We need to create spaces that are really intentional. We've talked a lot about intentionality, about compassion, about vulnerability. That needs to be really encompassed and embodied within an organization and reflected in everyone's behavior, especially leadership. Language matters. Show those things rather than just saying these kind of canned responses that most people are seeing right now, because it's trendy, honestly, right now, to do a lot of these things. So we want to see a little more depth to it in addition.
Yes, I would give a shout out to Gladstone in this moment, just because, I've been involved in these sorts of events many times, and generally they're really volunteer organized. But in this case, the communications department from this institute committed some of their, man hours, so to speak, to helping us organize, and for example, to like proofreading the emails that we sent to the panelists when we were trying to recruit them to join us here today. And that's a kind of labor that really makes a difference. So I just want to say that I'm glad to find that in this institution. I think that we can be asking this of our workplaces wherever we are.
Can I add something I'd really like to see? And that is better trans medical benefits. I'm so tired of talking to NIH trainees who tell me they're disappointed with the trans benefits. And I would really love to see that be a push. Like, if you cannot get good medical care, you cannot be your best self. And I would really love to see that change in the next period. We're talking a lot about healthcare now. We're talking a lot about mental health. We're so much more open to discussion right now around, because of the pandemic. Just something to improve trans health would be huge.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, Sharon. That is a really important topic.
Steph, I just want to add one quick thing that I stumbled upon. At my institution, I went in to update some information in our internal system, and within it, there was a, just pick your gender box. And this was something recent. And as I looked at it, it very clearly said men, brackets, men includes trans men. And that, just as someone who has a trans husband, I was just like, my goodness, that makes me feel held by my community here. And that's our, administration setting that up within our official space. And it's such a simple thing, but it makes the people feel so held in community.
That is so impactful. I'll mention that I'm about to begin to ask you guys about the next topic, which has to do with intersectionality and coalitions between communities that have something in common. And since we're talking about issues that are specific to many people, including transgender people, I will just note that I think often there's actually a common interest in there being that field to specify a name that may or may not already be a legal name, but is a name that is appropriate to address a person by. And this has some overlap with some people who are immigrating or visiting the United States as researchers who are coming from another country. In some cases, they would like to use a different name, sometimes because Americans are really bad at, for example, pronouncing certain Chinese names. And so they may use a different name. And this is a case where that same field in a database can be useful to multiple communities. And so this is an occasion where I feel like there's a coalition that could be established there. So now with this leading question, I will ask Jonathan, do you have any advice on how we can be creating coalitions both within our very diverse LGBTQ plus community, as well as with other marginalized communities?
Yes, I think anytime we're building coalitions, we have to be approaching them in this very culturally humble way. And I think sometimes as folks who have experienced marginalization, sometimes we can lead with our pain in some situations, and that can hinder us from being able to hear others' pain. And so I think I've seen it happen more than I would like, that people actually stop hearing each other. And so that can hinder the coalition building. So approaching it from a place of being culturally humble and really trying to think about what are the common goals, right? And that we don't need to homogenize. Sometimes too, there are these coalitions like, well, we all have this in common, so this should be the focus. And it's like, no, right? Going back to that intersectionality piece, like we can organize on this, and even though I don't have this in common, I can support you in these other ways as well. So having that bi-directional relationship and support going on.
Absolutely, recognizing connections, but also the diversity of experiences. So we have now officially entered the series of questions on intersectionality. I'd now like to just remind everyone that, of course, we're all living in this, these unique places where our identities intersect, which can, introduce unique challenges or opportunities. So I'll begin with Millie. I wonder if you would say that you have received different types of support from different communities that you may belong to.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And maybe you can relate to this, but the Latinx community has its own kind of approach to queer and trans communities. And that's been a really difficult kind of component of my experiences. There's not as much recognition. And there's often, language barriers, like I alluded to earlier as well. Within the science community early on, as we mentioned before, a lot of kind of what does your sexual orientation have to do with science, things like that. So there's been a varying amount, but as much as I can, intersect with every community and find that support that I need in that moment, culturally, I needed to feel like home, with, my Peruvian background, I needed to feel home through food, enjoying food and things like that. I would find that strength, I would find that, and hopefully those connections and that, just like Jonathan mentioned, that cultural humility, that connection there can be a foundation for connecting around a topic that might be a little more difficult. So that's been a way of kind of bringing together the wide variety of communities that I'm a part of. And I'm also just like an avid, person that likes a lot of different things. So it's been fun to integrate just a wide variety of communities, not only in my own identities, but hobbies and everything like that. So it's a multiplexed identity has been quite a lot of fun, but also kind of navigating how everyone else organically holds their own values is something that's been very interesting. Yeah.
I love multiplexed. I think I'm gonna use that moving forward. I would actually love to ask the same question of our other panelists. I wonder if we could ask Angel next and then Jonathan. Oh, sorry, I'm just gonna
repeat the question. That would be great. Thank you.
I'll just repeat the question. I wonder whether you've received different types of support from different communities that you may belong to.
I mean, certainly there's the point of resonance with the different communities, like Millie was describing, does change the way in which that support comes in. But I think, again, I come back to that idea of authenticity, which is why I needed you to repeat the question, because I was answering a question in the chat regarding authenticity and how that can be difficult in STEM. But I think the more we're held together by a system that doesn't work for everyone. I think that's at the crux of it all, right? I'm someone who has chronic pain that I've had for a very long time. And I broke myself a lot more than I should have working through my PhD because of the peer pressure, not even from my PI necessarily, but the peer pressure of you are not conforming with the way in which scientists do their PhDs because you should be working to the point of toxic exhaustion. And it took me a long time to put some of that down. And honestly, I didn't start putting some of it down till about 2 years ago. And I finished my PhD back in 2012. And so I think that, you know, I've gotten very kind of sidetracked from where we started, but that's my neurodiverse brain working for you here. I think that if you are authentic in whatever space that you're in, I think people respond to that because, again, we've all had the experience of being around someone who there's something they're hiding and it just creates some discomfort and distance. And I'm not saying you have to pour your life out to everyone, but just if you need support and you're going to a particular group that's skilled at one thing or another thing, I think I find myself combining the pieces of advice, I suppose. So if there's something that I don't know quite what to do with, I will go to all my different groups, some of which may be more enriched in LGBTQ people, some of which are, you know, underrepresented neuroscientists. I have this wonderful group I'm a part of that are just underrepresented neuroscientists. They're rad. Being able to get those different pieces of advice, the different perspectives, it helps me look at the issue in front of me in a new way, in a more nuanced way. And I think that does create more opportunity for being creative and breaking the mold a little so that you can grow.
Thank you for sharing, Angel. Jonathan, same question to you, different types of support from different parts of the world that you live in.
Yes, definitely. You know, and I'm going to echo a lot of what my colleagues have already said, but there's definitely ways in which different communities provide different types of support. And that's not always necessarily a bad thing. You know, every community won't be able to provide exactly what you need. So it becomes even more important for us to intentionally seek out different communities and pockets that can provide what we need. So I know sometimes there may be this belief that we can only access one community or one community will be appropriate for us. And so, and if that community falls short, then, oh, I guess, you know, I'm without, right? But it is actually good practice to go and find support where you can find it. And so I know personally I've experienced support from my LGBTQ plus colleagues, but they don't really get the race piece. They don't really get the Southern piece. Even that's a regional thing. I went to grad school in San Francisco and they were like, "You're from the South?" You know? And so there are these different ways in which communities can be supportive in some ways, but not in others. And again, that's not always a bad thing. But it's also important for us to know when we need to look beyond those parameters.
I'll just say it's kind of like having filters on a search engine, right? Like I have a question about my kids. I'm going to go, this is a real story again. Facebook has subgroups that are populated by people from my undergraduate school that is tailored to specific things. Like there's literally a group that's just about decorating your house. But it's the same group of people, like with that same shared identity of being from this space. And so like I can go to, right? I can filter which search engine I'm going to depending on the question that I have. And it's kind of wonderful. Like you're allowed to have that many different types of communities that you can get answers from. No one said you have to have one mentor because one person's never going to meet all your needs, right? So it's about building that network that lets you get what you need from the best source possible.
Such an important point, Angel. I will just reiterate that to everyone, no matter what career stage you're at right now. We all benefit from having a team, a roster of mentors who are each going to have their own sort of fortes. Some, you know, will be on sabbatical when you really need someone. So it's important to have multiple people who you can call upon when things come up. So absolutely, having more than one mentor is perfectly appropriate. There's no, you know, young people might think, oh, you know, there's like a privileged relationship with a single mentor. No. We all contain multitudes, and there'll be a different quality of connection with every mentor you have. To keep us on track, I'm going to move on to the next topic, which is current issues. So to add to everything that we've discussed already today, many current issues affect the LGBTQ plus community. The pandemic is certainly one, and so is the discrimination that many of us unfortunately continue to experience because of our identities. And discussing these issues in an open setting like this one can help lead to new ideas and hopefully promote positive change. I will begin with Jonathan. I'd like to know what you think about navigating conflict or discriminatory behavior, and are there challenges or opportunities that can arise when these things happen?
In what particular context? In the context of my profession? Is that what you're asking about? Or?
Yeah, in this case, we all live in the wide world. So, of course, if something happens to us in the supermarket, that can, ruin a work week. So let me just say that it can be broad. In this case, I was wondering in terms of like your trajectory through your career, if there were things that maybe changed your career path or anything like that.
Yeah, there have definitely been instances of discrimination and more emotional harm that I've experienced throughout my career. But go back to Angel's point, being a person at a lot of different intersections, you can't quite pinpoint what the trigger is, but there definitely has been those, and I think the ways in which I've dealt with them, it's one, prioritizing safety, right? So we always have to make sure that we're physically safe and that we're emotionally safe, that prioritize that. And I also, one of the ways, and maybe it's because I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, I always think about what are the ways in which I can grow from this and what can I learn from this? And I remember one time I was having a particular hard time with the supervisor during my postdoctoral training, and it was just toxic. Talk about toxic productivity, the expectations, toxicity, and what it meant to be a gay man, all of these things. And I was feeling really down, and my mental health was taking a dive. And one day I saw him in a meeting, and some little voice said in my head, he's miserable. And I said, oh my God. And the voice said, don't let miserable people make you miserable. And it was that sort of insight or revelation. And I'm a spiritual person, so I attribute it to my spiritual sort of ethos. But for me, that was like such a, oh my God. So even in these moments where I may feel beaten down and experiencing these particular types of biases of discrimination, there is a lesson there, and there is opportunities for empowerment. Like out of that moment came this level of empowerment that I still carry with me to this day, right? And so I encourage folks that we can't control others. We can't control other people's ignorance, because that's really what it is. We can't control other people's ignorance and fear. What our priority is to ensure our safety, but also how can we take what was meant for our harm and turn towards good for us? How do we learn from that? How do we grow from that? And then how do we do better with the people that we mentor?
That's excellent. Sharon, I'd like to ask you a similar question, especially in your role in, like a large research institution, to say the least, of NIH. Do you have any advice for like navigating conflict or discriminatory behavior in the workplace?
Yeah. So first I'll answer personally just for a moment, and then I'll talk a little bit more from the systems approach. So I like to view my energy as a pie, and I encourage students and staff that I mentor to do the same. You have a certain amount of energy and you get to decide where it goes. And sometimes I think it's worth correcting a microaggression or an aggression or really inappropriate behavior. And sometimes, especially when it's smaller things, I think it's worth letting them go. If I had $1 for every person who walked in and said, can I talk to the director? When I ran the lab, it was so clear it was my office, and it'd be like, well, where's your PI? And I'm like, I am the PI, right? I mean, if I focused on all of those, I'd have no energy. And so I think that there needs to be some context to decide how we respond. But I think because all of us have made decisions like that, for somehow it's bled into really inappropriate behavior that we all are complicit in allowing. I mean, the bullying and the harassment and the intimidation and the culture of science has got to change. You should not have to risk your mental health to get a PhD. 6-fold higher rates of anxiety and depression in PhD students, like, shame on us. And I think a lot of that comes from us all saying, well, get your paper and, you know, that's more important, or you're almost done, so finish. And so I guess I'm at a point in my career where I think that we have to learn how to protect ourselves and not to give all of our energy away to working to fight the system, but all of us have to put some energy into fighting the system, whether it be these kinds of discussions. I mean, there's this chat going on about perfectionism. I mean, it kills me because perfectionism is such a toxic thing to live every day because it doesn't exist. So you're chasing something that will never happen, and it just leads to procrastination, which leads to shame, which leads to kinds of messes. I feel like all of us have to say we want to change the culture. So it can be things like this. It can be showing up at anti-harassment training and really listening instead of saying, yeah, been there, done that, required. It can be stepping up as a bystander and being an upstander and saying, hey, that joke, inappropriate. Let's talk about it. I think if we all just keep going as we are, we're going to look one day at the culture of science and say, how did something with so much promise become something so horrible? We can bring the world a vaccine in a year, right? And I know there was lots of years of research before that because you know the people doing it, but look at what we can accomplish when we do our best. And yet we allow people to be demeaned and bullied and dismissed every day. And so I think everybody needs to know the system at their school. If the system at their school is inadequate, they need to know what other systems there are. If it's an NIH-funded institution, the NIH is now willing to engage in issues at university campuses. That's a change in our approach and one that I really value and think is important. All of us need to say, if we don't do something to change this enterprise with so much promise, 6-fold higher rates of depression and anxiety, like, shame on us.
And I will take this moment just to speak to sort of both sides of that, those sort of incidents. If you are a person who has been feeling demeaned or, like not feeling well, I just want to mention that there are many resources. I would definitely direct, especially the LGBTQ plus people who may be attending today or watching this recording at a later time, to reach out to the Trevor Project if you're ever not sure that you feel safe with yourself. And for others, for the allies who may be witnesses to these sorts of interactions that aren't great. Sharon mentioned being an active bystander or an upstander. So if you've ever had an occasion where someone said something that didn't sound good to you, but you weren't sure what to say, you can just start off by Googling active bystander training, and there are excellent resources available. At this point, I'm going to ask one last question in this question session, and then we're going to pivot to the broader Q&A. We have, lots of questions that we weren't able to get to in our main discussion. So we can start off with one of those. But before we jump into that, I'm going to have us pivot to something a bit more positive. I wonder, Millie, could you speak about what about the future of the LGBTQ plus community you are feeling hopeful for?
Yeah, I think this goes back to the beginning where we were talking about, I think particularly Jonathan brought up the opportunity to really define yourself and kind of defining queer as challenging assumptions and really having that opportunity to redefine everything around you and how you interact with it. I think that provides so much promise for future generations. The fact that I think more and more generations are really starting to, especially this pandemic has become this kind of incubator for like, oh, people are given space, maybe, that the length of space was a lot, but there was a degree of space that was given to people where so many people were coming out, we're realizing, giving that freedom, maybe that lack of judgment, that space, that their ability to really reflect on how they were interfacing with society was maybe not, was compulsive, perhaps. So that, I think, approach, and the more that future generations adopt that, I think that will make a really promising future for all of us to be able to challenge all of these notions that have been assumed, and taking this approach of like how it's always been done is not going to serve any of us. So I think this new generation of just trailblazers, I think, is going to be really promising for our own future. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Now, as we begin our Q&A, I'm going to start us off with a question around how we take care of ourselves. So I'd like to begin with Angel. I wonder if you could speak about, especially in light of the challenges of the pandemic, do you have any tips for the audience around how you practice self-care?
And my answer actually connects really well with what Millie was discussing about having the space to actually reflect. I think that one of the most important things that I do for myself is take time completely alone, because with how connected our world is, especially in the pandemic where everyone's just there. I have 2 small children. They're only here half the week, but they're still here half the week, and that's a lot of loud. Being able to make the space to actually turn off all the other stimuli so you can listen to your own voice. So I think often we're running around from spot to spot, thing to thing, and that inner voice gets lost. And that inner voice is the one that's going to tell you, hey, your mental health's not doing so well. You feel a little depressed. Or, hey, you've been holding your body in this one posture for 2 days. That's not good for you. Please go do some yoga. But if we don't make that space to actually honor that we need to listen to ourselves, then self-care kind of becomes impossible. Because self-care is not an act. It's not a bath or taking one short walk. It's a commitment to putting your own needs on your schedule. And to do that, you have to put yourself on the schedule also as a reflective space, right? Before you can do the experiment of, this is the self-care thing I'm trying, you need to come up with your protocol of, here's the issue, here's what ways in which I'm going to solve it. I think just learning to put ourselves on our own schedules and protecting that time. It's really challenging. You have to have just a lot of support around you to make you feel like you're not being just the most selfish creature in the world. But you're not, because you can't do your life's work if you aren't there.
Thank you.
That's kind of what it comes to. Yeah,
absolutely. I would like to now just be reminding our audience to please submit your questions in the Q&A. We are having, again, I mentioned that I have a second in command here behind the scenes, Bonnie Cole, who is a PhD student here at Gladstone, who is compiling questions, and especially the ones from Facebook or otherwise, and helping to compile ones that are similar into the Q&A. So I'm now going to ask Jonathan and also Sharon to address the same self-care question while those Q&A, while the questions finish coming in, and then we'll start on those. So please, Jonathan, do you have anything to share on tips for the audience around self-care?
Related to Angel's point of putting yourself on your calendar and making that space, I am the boundaries king. Like, my friends are like, oh, there's this boundary again. And I'm like, unapologetically, and not, again, sometimes people can feel like, oh, I'm being mean if I say no, if I say I don't want to do this. That is the only way that I know how to survive. It's being able to put boundaries around my time, around my mental health. And I, related to that, this scrolling and social media, there's a boundary around that too. Like, I go on there to promote stuff, but I am not going to be spending my energy on that, because it gets really draining. There's so much bad news in the world, right? And so it can really harm my mental health, and I'm particularly sensitive to those sorts of things. So I put a boundary around anything that could affect my mental health, and it is a practice. It is a way of life, and I do not apologize for it.
I appreciate that, and I just want to give a comment, especially to young people who kind of grew up with these these cell phone computers in our pockets with like, the whole internet inside of them. If you've ever been in a position where you're not sure how to stop checking Facebook, you can actually turn on the parental controls for yourself. And like, you know the code, but that extra few seconds that it takes to enter it, that can be enough time to like, pull the reins on yourself and recover some of your own agency. So I just want to give that little tip. Please, Sharon, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to put a plug in. Wellness for scientists is hard because the culture says don't do it. And there is a series that we run at NIH called Becoming a Resilient Scientist, which is really a wellness and resilience series with examples out of research spaces that pivots a little bit to boundary setting, assertiveness, and feedback with your mentor. And I want to put a plug in for that. From my perspective of my own wellness, I start every day. I'm a hyperkinetic person. It's very hard for me to sit. I start every day at Orange Theory. It was probably the thing I missed the most, except for my son during the pandemic. I'm back wearing a mask every day.
Good question. Is that a gym?
It's a gym. Yeah, it's a high intensity interval training gym program. But it's also cooking. It's also nature. It's also therapy. And I used to think I would do therapy when there were tough things happening, right? I was dealing with the estrangement with my family. Oh, therapy, my dad's going to die. Oh, therapy. Now I realize the best time to do it is when I'm feeling really good. And I can say, I want to do some hard work on this. And so for me, the pandemic and not having to go to an office has been a chance for me to revisit the power of a really supportive therapist. And it has been an amazing year for me. I realized things that I wanted to do that I haven't done. And it's been really great. And I would really think there's a lot of stigma around therapy. And I think we all need to be sharing how positive it can be. So those are probably my four biggest things: nature and food and exercise and therapy, and family is probably the fifth.
Thank you. And I'll just comment that the way that I tend to think of therapy, which again is so important that our workplaces provide insurance that will cover therapy. I think of it as sort of mental health insurance. All right, at this point, I'm going to start on the Q&A. So I'm going to say a question, and then I would love popcorn style for whoever has a thought first to jump in. Of course, if multiple people have thoughts, we can get through that. So to begin, this question says, as a mentor who would like to be an active ally, could our panelists address things that they wish that their mentors or colleagues knew and would do that would be supportive?
I'll jump in here if that's okay. Yeah, I would just say, know that you don't know everything, and it's okay. And don't ask me to tell you everything at the same time. And in that regard, still allow me to figure it out. Like, I think that was one of the best things that my mentors did, was they were like upfront, like, hey, listen, you study spirituality and health connections in LGBT populations. Like, I know LGBT populations, but I don't know spirituality and all this Black church stuff you're interested in, right? But I believe in you. And so here are the scientific methods, and I'm here when you want to come and have a discussion about it, right? I was like, great, that's exactly what I need, right? But sometimes mentors feel like, well, I don't know about that, so you should do this. No, right? Because then we're not allowing people to define themselves.
I would add, the best allies treat our relationships the exact same as they treat other relationships. They ask, they're curious, they don't squirm when somebody holds hands or talks about something happening in their life. So get over whatever discomfort you might have had, and appreciate there's good reason to have that discomfort. There was all kinds of negative messages sent forever, still sent. So it's fine to be uncomfortable, just work to get over it.
Yeah, I just echo that humility is incredibly important. I can think of a recent disagreement that I had. It was around disability related stuff with a mentor that is a very good friend who I respect immensely. And I was so pleased that we could have a very tough disagreement, but do it in a very respectful manner. Because at the end of the day, she respects me and I respect her. We just, I had a lived experience that she had no frame of reference for. But through that conversation, she heard me, she went and did some reading, came back, had another conversation, and she continues to be someone who is a wonderful resource. But that act of like actually fighting, I think there might have been tears even on my part, but I just get worked up. But being able to still feel in that moment, wow, we are fighting, but we are respectful. Don't get to the fighting part if possible. In this case, it just happened to be that way. But and the humility is at the core of that, humility and respect.
Thank you. Angel, I'd actually like to ask you the next question, which is an interesting one. So I think this is especially appropriate for people who have been teaching recently, but of course anyone can chime in here. The question is, how many of you have experienced bullying from students? How do you handle this? And how does your institution or colleagues support you?
So again, I'm going to say I've been lucky that I haven't had any major incidents. There was one not anonymous, but random email situation that doesn't really even warrant anything. The response, anywho, I'm not going to tell that story. And I think, again, to kind of identify where did that come from? Why don't I experience more bullying? And I think a lot of it has to do with I modeled this openness and vulnerability that I'm trying to prop up here as like a helpful way to be. As an example, I'm teaching freshmen in a freshman seminar, and we have to talk about critical thinking. The piece that they examine is a Facebook conversation that I had with someone from one of my alma mater groups about me asking for distraction helping tools because I just learned I had ADHD, but I didn't put that in the post. It was just like, hey, I'm having some issues. I want this thing. And that person saying, well, in my time, we used to use self-control and personal responsibility or something. In that moment, I'm being incredibly vulnerable with them, right? I'm sharing, I had this issue. This person said something horrible to me. But we're having a curious, engaged discussion about, okay, let's look at the assumptions that this person is making in their Facebook comment. And so in a way, I think the thing that protects me is I'm willing to just be me, make mistakes, own up to them, treat them as partners in the learning process. But also I still have that authority in so much as, here's something super vulnerable about me. See how well I can talk about it in an academic sense. And I'm still all right. So just not taking myself as seriously just can be, it humanizes me too, and that helps connect with the students. And again, I'm at a place, right, where our university has put trans men are men. We have gender neutral bathrooms in every building. We are a safe campus for LGBTQ plus folks. And so I think that adds to it. So perhaps look at the culture at the institutions that you're applying to. I know that's not always easy right now. It's hard. There's not enough jobs out there. But if you're going to go somewhere where that's going to happen all the time, it's going to erase your mental health out. You're not going to be able to keep up. And so maybe that's just not the place for you. And I think that's, I go with my instinct. Again, I blame credit my spiritual guides in that to connect to Jonathan on it. But I've tried to find places I feel safe being my whole self. And that helps.
Thank you. Unless there's another comment on this question of how to deal with this, like sort of, oh, please, yes, Jonathan.
Yeah, I will say, this kind of connects to the whole question about allyship too, is that having colleagues who get it to speak up so that you don't always have to, and being able to confide in them is really important too. Is something that I really value in these institutions. But I've definitely had students question my expertise and my pedagogical methods and things like that, and and actually call me intimidating anonymously on evaluations. Dr. Lasseter is intimidating, and I'm like, what? Where does this come from? Like, I know you all can't see me right now, but I'm like 5'2", okay? I'm always smiling. I'm like, what are you talking about, right? But there are these ways in which, given my intersectional identities, I'm coded in particular ways, right? And So there's definitely ways in which I do believe that students challenge me, and I wonder if they would challenge me in those same ways if I was this, white, cisgender, heterosexual male. And so ways that I deal with that is by confiding in colleagues and then having my colleagues who get it take up that cause for me so I don't have to.
And I'll say, I think one of the things that protects me is that same bias. But because I'm from India and I'm 5'10", it creates a different type of expectation on part of the students that might act as a protective mechanism because of their own preconceptions about, smart Indian people. And I have again, it's hard to pull apart those intersecting identities sometimes.
I want to add one other thing. It came up flew through my mind in one of the other questions you were talking about our role as mentors to LGBTQ students. I think we also have a role as mentor to students who have not grown up in welcoming communities, who live in places where they got unfortunate messages about our community, in countries where they haven't met any queer people who have happy, healthy lives because it's so suppressed. And sometimes I think that's a bigger role than I appreciate, because there are a lot of people who they know me through my job and they'll respect me because I gave some lectures they really liked, or I solved some problem, or they know I'm the person who approves their ability to get an extension. And so there's sort of this built-in respect for Dr. Milgram. And then, Dr. Milgram talks about her wife, and, Dr. Milgram says, here's how I take care of myself. And I think sometimes that gives them a place to say, well, wait a minute, maybe my assumptions about LGBTQ people is wrong. And maybe I should rethink the messages I heard as a child that it's a sin or it's bad. Long time ago, when some year 16 states were voting on gay marriage amendments, it was like the most devastating time. I mean, I'm older than everybody else on this panel. It was devastating. And there was a listserv that I was in charge of at the university I was working at, and students posted things about calling and making sure all these gay marriage amendments passed. And let's make sure that we protect marriage. And, I reached out to all the students that posted those messages and I said, can I talk? And sometimes I think that was a way more important thing that I did than every time when I talk to a student about coming out. Like sometimes I don't know. I think we have to sort of use our power if we have it. And I am at a place in my career where I have it, to say, come on, say some things that are, you want it, that you're thinking about gay people, say them to me so we can talk about them. So just it keeps going through my mind as we talk about mentoring. So I thought I'd put it out there.
I think that connects to the sort of conflict thing. Like, it's not always a bad thing. The conflict and the tension can sometimes lead towards growth and understanding. Yeah.
I'm hearing that it's important for us to the extent that we have energy to be doing this work, we need to be expending that energy on both sides of this conversation, shall we call it. Of course, supporting the LGBTQ plus youth, but also doing that work on the people who are in a position to be either letting, good progress happen or getting in the way. I'd like to now, actually, before I move on to the next question, I just want to mention that, Sharon, you were just mentioning marriage, which of course was, is, I guess, hopefully this is mostly taken care of in the United States. But there is a different issue today, and that is discrimination against transgender children. For some reason, that is very popular. So I just want to mention that, again, to the extent that we have energy to be doing work for the community today, that is an area where I think that work is really called for. All right, now I'd like to sort of pivot to the plus side that, is implied here. There are people who are just, here, I'll just read his question. Here we have from Professor Darren Hoffman. He says, I am a gay science faculty member, and I would love to have more LGBTQ plus students come my way for mentoring and support. What are some good venues for me to put myself out there? I'm totally out in my teaching, and I've been a support person for several young people through that exposure, but I'm curious if there are more direct ways or places for me to say, I'm here for you if you need me?
You know, there's a great organization, STEM, which is a student-run campus organization. And I think that that's one really great way, is to get involved in STEM. At every national meeting you go to the queer science mixer, there's mostly students there, or at least there's a lot of students there. I cried the first time I walked into one of those at SACNAS. I was like, I do not think I ever saw this many queer people, except at Pride, right? And these were all people who love science right here. So show up at those things, students will get your name and they will reach out.
Yeah, I would also recommend, I don't know how active you are on social media, but maybe using your social media platform as a way to connect with students. I'm often tweeting about things related to being a racial and sexual minority and resources, and sharing my story, as Sharon talks about how she shares her story, and you know, saying, you know, these sort of resources exist for these students, you know. And so I think definitely social media could be a way to do that as well. And also using your platform, as Steph was saying, like doing things like this. How often do you go out in your community and give talks, right? How often are you, maybe you can talk to high schools or community organizations so that they see it. And so when they are at that stage, they're like, I remember that person, I'm gonna go see what they're doing, what institution are they at? You know, so things like that. So just being as visible as possible, both in your circle, but also how can you reach beyond it?
Thank you. I'd like to also make a suggestion to Professor Hoffman. I think that if you're wondering how you can sort of be letting the students know that you are this resource, one option is to sort of have something on your door, or if there's room to have like maybe like one of those little sort of like free library type of things, because there are books and publications published by queer scientists. I happen to know that Dr. Shonda Prescott Weinstein is an astrophysicist. You're probably not an astrophysicist, but she is like a queer, Black, agender, you know, like scientist, and she's a role model and leader. And if you had a few of these books that were, you know, like next to your door, students could borrow them. You know, obviously this is just a suggestion, but, you know, perhaps just a piece of paper that says, you know, check out the hashtag 500 queer scientists. This is a wonderful community online, which was, I guess, originally, you know, striving for 500, but now they're far beyond that. Goodness knows there are lots of us. So these are just a few of the resources that you could be cluing your students in that you know about, so that they can pursue that and they can know that, you know, you're really in the know here and you're in a position to be giving them advice on these issues.
I mean, I'm on this panel because I filled out the 500 queer scientist things 3 years ago, and the organizers found me through that. And now I get to speak to over 130 people, even though we've been here for an hour and a half. So yeah, just the internet is so powerful. Twitter, academic Twitter, is wonderful. I've learned about so much cool stuff up there.
At this point, please, Sharon, and then I'll ask the last question.
Student groups, queer campus groups, they really need faculty to pop in. Sometimes they need faculty to buy pizza, but often they just need faculty to pop in. Get a list of, if there's a poster day, go visit a few of those posters, right? Be an extra warm presence for a moment. So that's one other thing that I think can make a really big difference.
Thank you. So I think now I'll ask our last question and then we'll do a quick close. So a question for anybody and everybody is, what advice do you have to people who are not sure whether or how to come out to their advisors, or, you know, perhaps their supervisors if they're a professional?
I don't think this is always right, but in general, I encourage my mentees to come out before choosing an advisor, because it's something very exhausting to deal with for 5-6 years. And if possible, I really encourage that. I encourage students when they go on grad school or med school or clinical psych interviews to ask about the LGBTQ community, to make sure that it's a safe place to be, and to be out And I say that knowing that some people are going to choose not to, and that's the beauty of getting to make our own decisions. But I've seen too many students really in negative situations because they didn't come out. And so I sort of favor early. I actually, when I was looking for this second job, this big transition, came out as early as I could. In one case, it was they sent a form about what does your spouse do? And I said, my wife is an artist. She will need studio space. And, you know, I don't know that, I mean, based on the institution, that might have been a problem, but I wanted to see if it was or it wasn't. And I appreciate not everybody can do that. There's a time to choose to do that, but the more you can be out with your advisor before you've committed to a long-term relationship, the safer and healthier you have a good chance of being.
I wanted to add one thing. I would also say talking to the other folks that have already been in their lab to get a better idea. I usually approach this kind of gauging whether a space is safe in a variety of different ways, both talking to people who have already been there, seeing what their experiences have been, even though they might not be the same as yours, and asking questions, even of that advisor, or I think of it also in a little bit of a professional space in terms of interviews for jobs and things like that. Asking questions about culture is really, really interesting. And there's ways to do that, not explicitly asking like, are you homophobic or do you engender this toxic nature? You can ask more about what they have done, and you can really show or see that they are kind of walking the walk and making those efforts to make people feel included and safe, and ask them what they did for folks to advocate, particularly through the pandemic. And often when someone has kind of that approach of creating space and compassion, that often will go along with someone who would be more receptive to you coming out. So it's a little bit of not a game, but kind of like an underlying way to gauge this receptiveness. Mm-hmm.
Also say, like, maybe this is just my particular cultural experience speaking here, but when we say, like, how do I come out to someone? I'm imagining all those movies where people have to, like, sit down with their parents, be like, Mom, Dad, I'm queer. And, like, that's not really what you're doing with the folks in your work environment, right? You're doing what Sharon described. You just occasionally, randomly, very, like, chill, drop a pronoun that lets them know that, your partner is X, Y, or Z, or, if I was speaking to my PI and was like, yeah, my ex-girlfriend, blah, 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 that's coming out, right? That's a quick conversation. And within a second, you're done. And so I also want to kind of,
sorry, Angel.
Process.
Sorry, I want to let you finish that, but I want to let you know that we are about to wrap. Please, was there anything else that you wanted to share there?
No, just kind of deconstructing the process. It's not scary unless you want it to be. Do the background research, get to know what the place is like. Definitely ask what is the support structures and social groups and other things available to advance LGBTQ scientists during like an interview process, and then just make a casual drop.
We might be able to summarize that by saying, do your research, which of course, we should all be well practiced in. All right, at this point, we have come to the end of our 90 minutes. I want to thank our 4 panelists so much for taking the time to be here today and for sharing their experiences and insights with us. Thank you also to everyone who has attended and asked important questions. Thank you in advance to everyone who watches this recording in the future. And thank you especially to Gladstone for hosting this event and everyone who worked hard behind the scenes. Again, shout out to Bonnie Cole and the LGBTQ plus community group here. As I mentioned, the recording will be available on the Gladstone YouTube channel. And you can also be following Gladstone on social media to keep this conversation going. You can find them at Gladstone Inst, like Institute INST, at Gladstone Inst on Twitter. So thank you again, everyone. And we look forward to having you join us next year.